Hello, everyone. James Donnelly, founder and CEO of the Casa Group, back for episode 17 of the Association Leadership Season 2, and very happy to welcome back the Donna Berger, shareholder
Hello,
at
James.
Becker Law Firm. Donna, welcome back.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, I think it's an appropriate topic today, hurricanes. June 1 just passed. Before we get going, I just want to remind everybody that from time to time, we do have people having trouble logging in and out, and that is what we should do. If you have any further problems, or questions, email info@casagroup.com, and our team, who's behind the scenes here, will help out. I also wanted to remind everyone that Donna is going to give us her thoughts on the legal aspects and more of hurricanes today, but it's not legal advice unless you're a client of hers. And this is an area, there will be a couple areas, I think, Donna, where we'll be recommending they do seek counsel, especially these days with all the changes in insurance and whatnot.
Most definitely. James, you know, as I'm sitting here, I just remembered there was a very famous hurricane, Donna. This was decades ago. I don't know if there's been a Hurricane James. We'll have to have the team check that out.
Well, it's interesting because we actually always call you Hurricane Donna, so I'm not sure what you're referencing, but we're going to do our polling questions again today, and as the first one is just kind of where are you in your COVID thinking, and really that's more for your benefit to see what everyone else in your peer communities are doing. So today we're going to do a quick COVID-19 update, a quick update on the vaccinations, and then jump right into to hurricanes. But there is some information we want to cover on that. So before we get into hurricane or COVID update, Donna, I want to start just by asking poll question 1, Mariness, about whether people have been adjusting their COVID policies. There we go. And Donna, while our audience is answering this question, I wanted to share some numbers. COVID in Florida, average 7-day, 1,293 cases, the lowest it's been in over a year. Texas, 1,414 average a day. I mean, that's still a lot of people, but those are, we peaked at about 17,000. So, I mean, it's less than
10%. Yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing I thought interesting, Donna, vaccination rates in Florida, 52% one shot, 42% fully vaccinated. I know as a contrast, my mom and dad always watch this webinar to hear us chat. And in Canada, they have a very high 1%, but like 3% second shot.
Wow.
They were slow getting vaccines. And so having 42%, and then Texas, 47% one shot, 38% two. So just for context, another 10% people had COVID. So 52% really could be closer to 62%. And this includes the total population. So the percentage of adults is really high. And I think that's
I was just going to say that. That's not counting the significant percentage of both of those states' populations consisting of children 12 and younger who are not yet being vaccinated.
Yeah.
We're doing pretty good.
We are. Thank God, right? It's just life does seem to, it feels like it's getting back to normal. And then the other thing I wanted to just highlight legislatively so the Governor DeSantis 21102 executive order just basically said eliminating all COVID restrictions in Florida. And also in Florida, Dawn, I'd like you to comment, emergency powers are ending June 26th or 27th?
27th, we think. We're not anticipating the governor to extend it any further. But that doesn't necessarily mean, James, that they're ending. Remember, there's the way the statute is worded is that the emergency powers, once activated, they continue for as long as is reasonably necessary to combat the emergency for which the order was originally imposed. So for some communities in some locations, that may mean that they can continue to use emergency powers for a reasonable length of time after June 27th, assuming the governor doesn't extend the order further.
So, and we're not expecting him, I mean, all his decisions in the last 30 days would indicate he's not going to extend it. I know we said that before, but I think this is really the date.
This is it, yes.
And so for our audience, kind of put a pin in our COVID discussions. First of all, we need a post-emergency order plan. But what you're saying is it doesn't have to be immediate on that date. There's a transitionary period that could be whatever reasonable is. And that's something I think our audience needs to talk about with their council.
Absolutely talk with council, because again, if you are in a community that's in a county where your numbers just continue to plummet and you don't have any active infections and you've been managing, operation of your amenities well, June 28th may be the day that you go back to complete normalcy, but in other communities that may not be the case. So speak to your council and see whether or not you should continue to enforce some of your protocols.
Okay, that's excellent. And same in Texas. There was the last executive order basically prohibiting any mask mandates in Texas. The other thing I think was important in Florida and in Texas is those states have declined the federal unemployment supplement starting this month soon. I don't know the dates exactly. The reason that's important, especially for our self-managed communities, is it has been hard to hire under $20 an hour labor. And that's primarily because, the alternative was to get the benefits. So that's going to help us, our ability to hire our critically important frontline teammates. So, obviously if you're managed by a management company, your management company is dealing with that. But if you're self-managed, I think you will find it a little easier to staff after this month. And so let's see the poll results, Mariness. Interesting, Donna. Get them shared. There we go. So we have 4 communities that increased their restrictions, and I have to believe that was probably an infection or a situation. And I'm actually happy to see that because, Donna, even though we're all trending to less or no restrictions, that seems to me to be a prudent board adjusting to the facts in the field.
Absolutely agree. I mean, again, boards are charged with operating and administering their specific community, not just looking to see what other people are doing. And I think these numbers, James, really reflect that.
Well, that's interesting. I got to share a chat question here. Someone did an internet search. Dina, thank you. James, name of hurricane my name has not been retired yet, according to internet search. So I still have a chance to have a Hurricane Donna. I mean, a Hurricane James, but a Hurricane Donna is now retired. So you will never get another one, Donna.
Oh well.
I'm holding out hope. Okay, so and most of the results showed a decrease as expected. But Donna, before I leave this, because I know I have a lot of our audience that are still getting pressure from residents saying, why have you not just lifted all of the restrictions? What do you say to these boards that are struggling with, what do they do now?
Okay, so let's be clear. With outdoor amenities, the pool, if you've still got that closed down, I think you really need to speak to council and figure out why you're still holding on to that. At this point right now, the CDC has said outdoors you can go maskless. Even people who aren't vaccinated may, as long as they're not in crowds. So if you've still closed down or really curtailed your outdoor amenity operations, I think it's time to probably let that go. Again, I'm not giving you direct legal advice, but speak to your attorney regarding that. Now, in terms of the indoor confined spaces, again, we've still got until June 27th. We're under a statewide state of emergency, but this is where you're going to want to start thinking about your unique community. Do you have an infection? Do you have tight spaces? Can you loosen up? And should you continue to make a distinction between vaccinated and unvaccinated people in terms of your facial covering rule? Right now, the CDC continues to make that distinction with regard to indoor areas. So I think it's reasonable for boards to continue to make that distinction as well. I think we talked about this the last time we met, James, and nothing has really changed in terms of that distinction. We talked a little bit about some communities are allowing people who want to voluntarily provide proof of vaccination to use certain indoor areas, go maskless, and that includes in the elevators. People aren't forced to, but if they want to say, hey, I'm fully vaccinated according to the manufacturer's requirements, you can go maskless. talk to your attorney about it, but it is time to start really reevaluating these protocols and making sure that you're keeping up with the current trends.
I will tell you, we're getting a lot of, first of all, at the employer level, Castle still requires our teammates to wear masks in the buildings. You know, we'll be the last ones to unmask. But I can tell you the building I live in, masks are not required anywhere in the building if you are vaccinated and with voluntary compliance. So, I mean, anyone that you see in our building that has a mask on is likely not vaccinated, but there's an example of a policy out there. We don't manage that building, but that's probably a good thing.
And look, airports and planes are still requiring masks, whether you're vaccinated or not. I was in a restaurant the other day, James. Half the wait staff had masks, half did not. I actually inquired of my waiter and said, you know, what are you guys doing? And he said, for those of us who are vaccinated, we're not wearing them. For those of us who aren't, they must wear them. And some people were vaccinated and continued to wear them. So it really is coming down to a matter of personal choice. But again, remember, in a mandatory community association, you're still subject to board rules and the restrictive covenants. So it's not a complete, you know, this is my personal choice, because in community associations, there's 50 years of case law, at least in the state of Florida, that says your home may be your castle unless you live in a multifamily building, in which case, not so much. You're subject to rules and restrictions.
Excellent. Well, that's a good update, Donna. Thank you. I want to put up a poll question to Mayor Ness because we're going to jump into our hurricane preparation and planning discussion. So I guess the first question, and so we have, does your association have a hurricane emergency plan, and has your association contracted for recovery services? And Donna, we'll come back to that. But again, this is kind of for guiding our discussion and for our listeners to see what the other communities are doing. But tell me about the requirement for a hurricane plan. Is it a legal requirement, or is it a good practice?
You know, years ago, James, the statute was changed at one point to make it a legal requirement. This was for a very brief period of time that boards must have an emergency plan in place. That is no longer the case in the state of Florida. I'm not sure about Texas, but it is certainly encouraged for boards to have a plan in place. And that plan should cover a host of things, including how they prepare before a storm, comes ashore, what they do during the storm, and how they recover afterwards. And those plans should include helping your residents prepare. We're going to talk a little bit about date stamping and photographing the community. When do you let your workers go home? Are you going to have to evacuate the building? Do you have a backup generator? Afterwards, how do you determine whether or not the building is safe to go into? And in our homeowners associations, that would include other types of buildings like a clubhouse. So certainly we're encouraging all boards, regardless of where they're situated, to have that emergency plan in place.
Let's share the results, Mayor Ness, of this poll. So we have 64% of communities have emergency plans. And I'm going to add that I don't know is in there. I'd be surprised if it wasn't more like 75%. Mm-hmm. But a good portion don't, Don. And I think this is something that we actually have some templates. Maybe we'll put those up on the website. And then contracting for recovery services. I really like to see that 50% of our communities. And we're going to talk a bit about that. So you said we no longer have a specific legal requirement, but there are some legal implications of not having a plan, actually probably more insurance related implications. But before I leave that, so we've talked about whether you should have a plan. Now, pre-contracting, our experience is when there's a storm, you don't know where it's going to hit. Let's say it hits our building and you have significant damage. There is going to be a rush to all the landscape vendors, the restoration vendors. So we think it's a good idea to have arrangements pre-storm with certain contractors. And what that does is two things. One, it puts you at the top of the queue, and two, you've established pricing usually on a kind of per unit or per hour basis. So it's not, you don't have to negotiate it after the storm's passed. Do you have any comments on contracting in advance of storm with vendors, Donna?
Well, absolutely agree with you, James. It's 100% recommended because you've got some budget certainty. For instance, with landscaping, and let's take our homeowners associations as an example. A lot of these communities, we've got very mature landscaping. If you get a direct hit, you may have trees crossing the roads where you have now impeded ingress and egress to the community. It's going to be crucial to get that debris removed immediately. So 100% agree that you should be contracting, putting that in your contracts with regard to how quickly can your landscaper get out there just to do even the most basic, not replanting things, but at least removing the debris. And what is it going to cost? Let's have some expectations. And this is also going to help, James, to calm your community down. I do recommend that boards put out, if you know a storm is coming, let people know what's going to happen. We do have an arrangement with our landscaper. Debris will be removed within, let's say, 48 or 72 hours. This is going to happen. Our staff is going to go home at this time and return when it's safe to do so. I think that, look, you said have a plan. Absolutely. What a plan does is help ratchet things down. It helps calm people to know we've got things in place. And I would also say I would like to see, when people are amending their documents, to make it a requirement to have an emergency plan in place. Let's be honest, some boards are better and more proactive than other boards. And I've seen communities that go from very proactive boards and those people leave. And then we get in a board that's a little more lax when it comes to planning, and vice versa. So I would actually like to see it be a requirement under the documents that there be an annual emergency plan.
Yeah, I agree. Maybe there's some size threshold, not that even every household should have a plan, but certainly there's some effort that goes into that some smaller communities maybe not have the resources. So yeah, and these contracts, I mean, they're particularly sensitive because they're anticipating future. I really think it's worth a quick review by your attorney on these, pre-storm contracts, with agreement on time of turning up and whatnot. One more thing, you mentioned landscaping. We've had this experience in several storms. I remember the two storms of 05 or 04, 05. Some of the communities will get debris removal from FEMA or state. And so, but that doesn't change the fact that we have to get the roads open. So what we found is that we were contracting with landscape vendors for clearing the roads and not necessarily removal, because often that is done through a federal or a state program. So you don't want to contract for things that are going to be done for you otherwise, is my point. That happened to us in several communities.
And I would only say, though, I would add to that, James, that this has been a longstanding fight with FEMA, because FEMA over the years has taken the position that they won't reimburse cities who remove debris inside guard-gated communities. I know the CAI has been fighting that for years, but I agree with you. Why pay twice for something? And by the way, some cities went ahead and removed the debris inside guard-gated communities, even if they were not going to be reimbursed by FEMA.
Yeah, in fact, Michael has sent in a note that FEMA.gov has some pre-printed plans, as do we. So it's a good point, Michael and Donna. You don't have to reinvent the wheel here. I mean, the 90% of a plan is fairly similar from building to building. Okay, so we should have a plan. We have a plan. We've contracted with vendors to take care of our recovery. I think it's a good point you made early in your comments, Donna. It's management's job to make sure that building's safe to go back in. And so we have a very specific protocol. In fact, we've generated an app, Donna, where every manager goes through a checklist, and that once it's complete, pre-storm, it goes to our home office so we know it's done. And then post-storm, the manager, we know that they've been there because it's done through an app. And then we also know where to deploy resources, because in most cases, it's fairly narrow band where, we're statewide, but it's only a few communities that are having the serious damage.
And remember, James, if a storm is coming, the governor's going to issue what? A state of emergency, which means now our emergency powers are activated in Florida. And now we're getting back to the original purpose for which those statutory emergency powers were granted, which is to deal with this.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think our boards are going to get used to living under emergency powers, because right when we're going to lose them for the pandemic, we're going to get them back probably for a storm. I hope not. All right, I want to put up poll question 3, Dawn. I want to move to insurance. And I think we may want to bring Andrea or someone back and go through the whole insurance again. But there's never been a better time to be reviewing your insurance. And I also threw in the question in the same poll, because I had too many questions, Donna, about some steps we should take to make sure our insurance claims have a better chance of being honored. But first of all, what should we do with our insurance policy? Do we have a meeting with our insurance agent? Do we get our lawyer involved? Obviously, management has some expertise. What's kind of step one in making sure we have the appropriate insurance in place?
Well, step one, James, is knowing what you have. So we've seen this over the years that some boards think they have just a one windstorm deductible, only to find out if they have 10 buildings, they actually have 10 separate deductibles. So the first thing is knowing what you have. That's a twofold process. Certainly sit with your insurance agent and go through it. And secondly, sit with an attorney who understands insurance coverage. For instance, for my clients, I'm not the insurance expert at the firm, but we have an attorney and that's what he does. So I ask him to look over a client's policies. And so you know what you have, that way you can best prepare. Do you have the funds available to meet your uninsured losses, including the deductible? Secondly, and this seems so basic, James, but make sure you have that policy somewhere. If all you have is the written policy and it gets blown away in the storm, because some buildings, if they're in the direct path, if they get a direct hit, we don't know what could happen. So make sure you've got a backup, you've stored that somewhere. I mean, it seems so basic, but store it in the cloud, send a copy, forward it, but make sure you've got access to that policy in the immediate aftermath. You also have to know whether or not your policy requires the board to make the repairs and then seek reimbursement, or if the insurance company will pay and you don't have to make the repairs first. If you have to make the repairs first, you better make sure that you are financially able to do so. And I'm sure, James, that you and Castle have set up lines of credit or urged your clients to have available lines of credit to make these post-storm repairs.
Yeah, you said a lot there. I'm going to try and unpack it a little bit. Well, one of the things is the last time to be looking for documents is after the storm when you need them. So it sounds really basic, but you should have both electronic and hard copy. We have these hurricane binders. We literally put them on a flash drive and keep them on our person. But do make sure you have both your documents and the insurance documents available, and probably the copies of the contracts that we talked about earlier. And then you also mentioned funding. This is really interesting. So all hurricane policies have deductibles and sometimes copays. And these can be huge amounts, right? If you have a $50 million claim, I know that's a lot, and a 5% deductible. I mean, where do you come up with $2.5 million? And so there's a number of different ways to look at that. One is to have a line of credit, you mentioned. Another is, in fact, one of the ladies that chatted in, I think it was Phyllis, said they have a fund, like they have a reserve fund just for this, which is also a good idea. And then, the third one is wing it and, see what you do, but you just don't know. And it's a tough one. I think the line of credit's probably the best one in that you don't pay a lot for it, but, to have all those funds there, or maybe you do a hybrid, it's a lot of cash tied up for an eventuality that may not happen in 10 or 20 years. But I think
you asked one question about how do we know we have sufficient insurance. This comes up a lot with clients. So you have to look to two places. The statutes, let's say it's a condo, because 720 does not address this, but let's say it's a 718 condo in Florida. It says that the board has to use best efforts to obtain adequate insurance, okay? But you also have to look at your documents. I had a client recently where their documents actually said that they needed specific types of coverage. Replacement costs, law and ordinance, all risk coverage. You need to be looking in both places. And this is probably why, to your point, it's a good idea to speak both to your insurance agent and to your attorney to make sure you're covering your bases and that the board has obtained the coverage they need to obtain. Now, if you can't get the coverage that your documents require, what do we always say? Amend your documents if you can.
Well, that's true. The insurance industry doesn't really care what's in your documents. They're all about risk management, their risk management. What I love about insurance, and I'm probably sounding anti-insurance. I hope I don't have any agents on the call, but it's always yes to get the policy. And then when they have to pay out the claim, there's, oh, well, the no's come a little faster, but there are public adjusters for that. We could talk about that later as well. So yeah, funding, it is important. I just realized I haven't shared our poll results here. So Ness, share our poll results. Have you recently reviewed your hurricane? We're at 73. It's probably more like 83%, Donna. And to your point, this review should be done. Here's your policy on one side of the desk, and here's your document requirements on the other. I would actually push this on, not that you're not responsible as a board, but you should get the insurance agent to commit that the coverage matches what your required coverage is. And those two things have to align. And I can't tell you how many situations I've talked to and that question just wasn't asked. It's super
Well,
important.
I think if Andrea was here, she'd probably say that the agent is not going to be in a position to do that. But certainly this is where that collaboration comes in between the board, agent, and attorney. I don't know that I would require an agent to opine on what the statutory requirements and the documentary requirements are, but certainly laying it out. This is one area where you cannot have your head in the sand. You need to know what your coverage is and what you're looking at if you actually suffer a catastrophic loss. A lot of times, if they don't have law and ordinance coverage, James, their policy is not going to allow them to rebuild.
Yeah, did you explain law and ordinance?
Really simply, law and ordinance means that you have sufficient coverage to rebuild your building and the improvements to today's building code standards.
Which is likely higher than when you built the building.
Which is much, much higher and more expensive.
Okay, the second question here, and I want you to comment on it, Donna. Do you have date stamped or video photography of your association? 16% yes, a lot no. This looks like an opportunity. Donna, why do we need this?
Well, I think you touched on it when you said that there's a lot of yeses when you're purchasing the policy and a lot of no's when you want to make a claim. So, and this is not to disparage any insurance agents or the insurance company executives listening to us, but many times the response when an association makes a claim, the response is, this is a failure to maintain or pre-existing damage, okay? This is why date stamped video and date stamped photographs is so crucial, because if you've got a date stamped video of your roof a month before a hurricane hits and it's in perfect pristine condition, and now the storm passes and it's a wreck, you have the proof to legitimize your claim. And anything you can do to help legitimize the claim is going to help you obtain the maximum recovery. And so again, was it 16%, James, that said that they had date stamped video?
Yeah, 16.
Yeah, that number needs to be a lot higher, folks. I actually have clients in multifamily buildings. Some of them are actually renting drones so they can go up and take the pictures of the roof, on all the balconies, the windows. But it's going to be crucial to have that. And again, if anybody listening has prior storm damage, I actually have a few clients that are still grappling with Irma damage. You need to get that fixed before the next storm comes, because what will happen is they're going to say that's pre-existing damage and they're going to deny your claim.
Well, you've teed me up perfectly for the next question. But, Donna, we have very experienced board members for the most part listening to this. And so, the poll results tend to reflect that. But that was one of the few poll results where I saw an opportunity, maybe a takeaway from this webinar for the boards and managers, to make sure that we can document that the state of the building pre-storm. Okay, Ness, put up question 4, please. I want to talk, Donna, you just mentioned document what your building's like, but also you mentioned, what if you have unfinished work or to be done work or work that's should be done, it's not done. While our audience is answering the question, do you have pending or current contract repairs projects in your community? Why is this important, that having projects in flux at this time? Why is that important?
It's important, again, because the standard pushback from an insurance company, particularly with regard to a large claim, James, is going to be, this was pre-existing damage. Therefore, and that's always an exclusion under your policy. Look, it's unfortunate, James, but it's not a level playing field when we're talking about the, claim recovery. I have one particular client on the West Coast. They had a massive Irma claim. They have not been able to make those repairs. Well, twofold. Not only they needed to get the insurance funds, and then their insurance company filed for bankruptcy protection. So now they're struggling with FIGA. And where are we? We are early June. I don't know when they're going to be able to make all these massive repairs. God forbid they get hit again. They're going to be out of luck. So it's unfortunate, but it really is not a level playing field with the claims recovery. This is why the funding is so important. The individual who chatted in and said that they have a special reserve, very smart on that association's part. You really do need to put away, I'm going to use a terrible pun, for a rainy day here, but it totally makes sense because, and again, look at your policy. You could have multiple storms hit. I think we had one season, didn't we, James, where we had a couple storms hit Florida, one after the other in one area. A few buildings got hit twice.
Yeah, it was remarkable. Let's share the results, Ness, of this. It looks like we have a lot of projects going on, Donna. And I want to, Hope's telling me it was 0405. We had those 3 storms in a row. So, yeah, good.
You've got such a good team. The Castle
I'm surrounded by a good team here. Yes, you mentioned something there. Oh, here's the result. So 64% have projects. We can take that down now.
James, let's just be sure though. These are projects. We're not talking about renovating your lobby, folks. We're talking about window replacement, roof repair or replacement, stucco repairs. That's what we're talking about. If you have those projects pending, or even the balcony restoration, and you get hit again and you don't complete those projects before the next storm hits, that can jeopardize your claim.
And I want to be specific. You mentioned like deferred maintenance is not something that insurance company is going to come and fix and make good. This is why this photography is so important. But the other thing that I want to highlight is there is a responsibility. I don't know how it's documented in the insurance forms, that you kind of do everything you can to mitigate damages. So not only should you get projects done, but you should also, sometimes we're in the middle of projects and there's a protocol that we have to go through, to get scaffolding down and whatnot. So that's also important, I think, in terms of defending a future insurance claim.
Yeah, I mean, listen, in an ideal world, James, people would in an ideal world, boards would stay on top of the maintenance obligations of the community. Sometimes we do have boards that put it off, either because because the members don't want to pay for the maintenance, or the boards aren't prioritizing it. But again, in an ideal world, that maintenance would be top of mind always. And then secondly, you would be able to do those projects and complete them before the active months of our hurricane season. Because again, as you just pointed out, you don't want a construction site that's going to pose a potential problem if a storm hits and you've got construction materials everywhere, cranes and the waste receptacles and everything else.
Donna, there's an interesting question from Susan here. Do the existing projects include landscaping such as palm pruning or oak tree trimming? This is interesting in that I know a lot of our communities do those prunings before the storm, so there's less debris. By the way, way in front of you. Don't want to do it the day before because there's all kinds of things in those trees. But would you include kind of prepping the landscape as something that would be important as a risk mitigation? And 2 factors. One is just the safety of your community, but the other is insurance. Insurance doesn't cover landscaping, so it's probably not relevant for that.
No, I agree that pruning and getting and removing any dead foliage, that's all important before going into storm season. You're right. Landscape, I've never seen a policy where the insurance will cover replacement for landscaping. Typically doesn't cover screening, doesn't cover fencing, items like that. So you may not want to do a beautification project in the midst of hurricane season. You may want to do that in November if you're going to be doing a massive landscape, just a beautification project.
Yeah. We have another comment here. We have a documented claim for roof replacement from Irma, and this we have several communities like this. Will the existing claim be impacted by that? That would be a very interesting discussion, especially if it's a different insurance company.
Yeah, I mean, will the existing claim be impacted? Probably not, but if you get hit again, your future claim is going to be impacted if you can't show that you've made the repairs and that your improvements were sound and watertight before the next storm came rolling through.
Okay, so I'm just going to kind of bring that one to closure. The bottom line is that you should get any projects done to the extent that you can before the storm, both for safety and to make sure there's no arguments about what the status was before the storm, and document that with video and photography. I want to move on to the most important part of hurricane preparedness, and that is our residents and their safety. I want to put up poll question 5, Ness. Donna, you and I talked about this yesterday. Do you have emergency contact information for all your residents? And for condominiums, co-ops, do you have keys to all the units? Start with emergency contact information. Donna, why is that important?
It's important because if the building or the community is under a mandatory evacuation order, James, and you've got people who are refusing to leave, one of the things that a board can do or a manager is reach out to the emergency contact, and which is typically an immediate family member or a close friend, and say, hey, we're shutting down the building or we're shutting down the community. Joe won't leave. Can you reach out and help us? We're worried about it. Because, and I know you want to talk about evacuation. There's certain steps that are going to be taken. In some cases, the electricity is shut down, or people stay in these buildings and they stay at their own risk. But again, there's a moral obligation to make sure that your residents are safe. So emergency contact information is very useful in that regard.
Ness, let's share the results of that, please. So yeah, most of our communities do. And what's interesting is we have normally have a fairly even mix between HOA and condo, Donna. And I know there's a tendency for condos to have more emergency information than HOAs, but that's a plus our unknown. That's very nice to see. And to your point, this is not necessarily just a legal obligation, but a moral one. We run into situations, I want to talk a bit about mandatory evacuation in a minute, where we, keep that up for 1 minute. Hope I want to talk about the co-ops, where we had an elderly lady in the 20th story of a high rise, and it was mandatory evacuation, and we did not know she was there. And so obviously her relatives, phoned after the storm, and thank God, because there was no power to the building, and she had medical needs, and we had to go up and help. But I have 2 comments on this one from a management perspective, Donna. One is try and get emergency contact information for everybody, because it's so helpful in an emergency. And 2, in mandatory evacuations, you are going to have people not leave. And you could say, and I'll stop in a moment to let you opine on the legal side of that, but if you know someone's in that building, you want to know when management will leave the building, and we can talk about that timing in a minute. We need to know who's in that building, so when we come back, we can go and make sure they're okay. But what's the legal obligation of an association to take care of people in a building when there's mandatory evacuation?
So I think I mentioned this to you at one time, James, that the statutory emergency powers actually came about years ago as a result of one of my clients in Pompano Beach. It was a 7-story building. A storm was coming. They were under a mandatory evacuation order. Board, issued an alert to all the residents. We're shutting down the building. This building was self-managed. They shut down all of the electricity, the elevators. And a core group of people, the board members all left. They followed the evacuation order, and the majority of the residents left as well. But there was a core group of owners that stayed. They broke into the office. They turned back on the electricity. One guy broke into the storage facility and took out a few lawn chairs. Another guy ran to the gas station and got some liquor, and they were having a hurricane party. And it happened at the time my board president reached out to her state senator and said, this is crazy, because if these people had been injured or killed, Guess who they would have sued? They would have sued the board. So part of the statutory powers language contains a liability shield for boards in an evacuation order when people stay. So again, the legal obligation is once the board says we're under an evacuation order, we're all leaving. If they can't get people to leave, it's a terrible situation, but the board's not going to be liable if those people stay and they stay at their own risk and they are injured or killed. That being said, you're not, as a board, you're not responsible to go and forcibly pull people out of their units. And I don't recommend doing that. But many of the boards, and I'm sure you can speak to this in terms of how Castle manages it, they do go around and knock on doors. Unfortunately, sometimes people aren't honest. So they may say, yes, we're going to leave. We're probably leaving a few hours after you're leaving, and then they don't leave.
Well, we can't help people from themselves. Did I share these results, Ness? If not, please do. So that was, do you have emergency contact information? Yes. The second was for condos and co-ops. Do you have keys to all the units? Donna, why is this important?
Well, a lot of people use those keys again to check if there's an emergency situation. So to your example, James, you had the woman who stayed in there. She needed medical attention, but she stayed anyhow. Maybe something happened. Maybe she's unconscious in there. If you've got a key, you can get in there. Of course, you can always get in if you need to knock down a door and break through a window. It's easier if you have a key. Some communities do use the keys for owners who are absent, who maybe, leave for the summer, and they use those keys to go in and maybe lower shutters or remove items off the balconies. I would say half of my communities have keys and half don't. Remember, in a condo, the board has a legal right to access the unit upon reasonable notice. This doesn't mean if you've got a key, you can go use that key and go into anybody's unit at any time. You need to statutorily give reasonable notice.
Yeah, I will say though, as manager of many condos, and I see Ellen has said that they have a master key situation in their community, which is effectively the same thing. But it's not just for hurricanes. I mean, you get a flood in a vertical building and it's going to be at the bottom of the building quickly. So I can't emphasize enough that there should be a concerted effort to get keys. And I know some people are reluctant to give them, but there's great key systems that we have in the condominiums that secure those keys. So, but access to units.
Let's talk about one dirty word: mold. Okay, so if the storm hits and you've got water intrusion, either because the roof has been damaged or it's coming in through the windows or it's coming in through the sliding doors on the balconies, you're going to want to get in there and dry out those units as soon as possible to prevent mold. And I think most owners get that and they understand. Remember, we talked about that. I said, put people on notice ahead of time. This is where that notice comes in, because your plan, when you communicate to owners, can include, if we get hit and we've got water intrusion into the units, we are going to go into your unit. We're going to have a restoration company come in. We're going to dry out the units. And by the way, in Florida, the emergency powers give the board the right to assess the owners directly for drying out their units.
That's an important point. That comes up many times, and I'm going, why am I being singled out? Well, the powers are in place for a specific unit if they're the cause. Okay. So we have one more question, because I want to talk about, we've talked about the residents, we talked about mandatory evacuations. Ness, put up question 6 while I ask Donna one more question. Donna, especially in these mandatory evacuation situations, and we're doing our best to figure out who's still in the community. Do we communicate to law enforcement, if we have a list before we leave the property?
I think that's a great idea. Yeah, I mean, remember we talked about it. You're not going to go in and forcibly remove people, but you should make every attempt to help remove these people when you're under a mandatory evacuation order. You can do that one of two ways. You can appeal to their emergency contacts to help, reach out to local law enforcement. We have had local law enforcement go into some buildings and knock on doors and remove people.
I just was looking at my notes on this Barrier Island. Mostly in storms, as most of us know, they will actually shut down the bridges. And the bridges go up for the storm, and then after the storm, the bridges go down, but you're not allowed on that very island without a pass. And so one of the things on our checklist, and this is particularly important for the self-managed communities that may not have this protocol, is you want to make sure your staff, your team, have the necessary passes to get back on those barrier islands. And we have a lot of barrier islands wrapping this state, so it's a lot of communities that this impacts.
James, do you think it's possible that some people are not leaving because they've got pets? And for some of our vulnerable residents, they may have service animals or emotional support animals, and they don't want to evacuate because they don't feel that they have anywhere to go with those animals.
You know, I did not put that in my notes. I know you and I spoke about this yesterday, but that's a great point. And more people have pets than ever, especially after COVID. And the mental health support has been fairly dramatic. And I do know a lot of shelters won't take pets. So I'll bet that is a reason why. But can you imagine if you're in a high rise and you have a pet and you can't go out? I would make arrangements for pets.
But that is part of the emergency plan. Seriously, I mean, when you're thinking about everything, if you're either a pet-friendly community or you've got disabled residents with service animals and ESAs, maybe part of your plan is, hey, let's get some information of where these folks can go with those animals in the event that we are under a mandatory evacuation order.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. We always put a link to a list of shelters, and the shelters kind of self-identify whether they're pet friendly or not. You brought up something there, though. Really, the pet plan is really a personal plan, and we've talked about plans, hurricane plans for the community, but every individual should have their plan. Where am I going to go? What am I going to do? Where's my car? Is my gas tank full? All of those things. Am I going to just leave town or stay? I read a very interesting article recently because I live on the 42nd floor of a condo. The wind speed between the bottom and the top of a 500-foot building is dramatically different. And for those of you live high up, it may be a category 1 or 2 at the bottom, but it could be a category 3 or 4 at the top of that building. So
James,
staying in high rise is not a good idea.
With me. We're single family house, generator, and impact windows.
Yeah, I'm coming to your place. Well, funnily enough, we've set up this building. I'm at home office at Castle. We stay here for 2 reasons. 1, it's built for hurricanes. 2, I need to be quarterbacking the recovery the day after. So it's kind of cute. Hope gets me all set up here. So, okay. I want to talk about communications. What we've done, we have a CERT, Castle's emergency response team. And we, did we share these results yet? Oh, sorry. Please share. There we go. That's the special needs that we kind of talked about that.
But almost half have not identified their vulnerable residents, James.
Yeah, but look at how many have actually. That's interesting. But yeah, I mean, and we talk a lot about condos because they're vertical, but we manage a lot of. I mean, Florida's full of adult plus 55 plus communities, and there's just so many different needs in older communities. It would be great, whether it's a condo or an HOA, to know who's living where and what their needs are. Okay, we're as usual coming to a close here, Donna. I want to talk about communicating. I was mentioning we have a CERT plan, and we basically have 96, 72, 48, 24-hour communication protocols to the residents. And sometimes we don't get 96 hours, so sometimes it all gets condensed. But how often, when, to who should we be communicating in advance of a storm?
Well, I don't think you can communicate too much. The more channels you have, the better, because some people respond to the emails. In some of our HOAs where, we've got boards using an automatic text system, and I would send out the information, as often as possible, in as many channels as possible. Look, a newsletter is not going to work, okay? But in an HOA, if you've got a bulletin board, you can, in multifamily buildings, you can certainly post things in the mailroom, in the elevators. But again, this gets back to the emergency plan, and I think, we saw over the last year and a half, James, how people have embraced technology. I'd like to see that continue with these kinds of emergencies, which is, hey, if you've never considered using a text alert before, maybe now's the time to consider it. If you've never, group email is also a great way to get something out, but you need to be able to get to people quickly. And the best way to do that is with one of these, right? A phone. And that everybody's tethered to these things more so than logging in, on an email or to a association website. If you can get to their phones, you can get to them. And some communities are even doing robocalls when it comes to emergencies.
Yeah, it's a great point. To your point, you can't over communicate, and a lot of it's about managing expectations, especially when when is the guard going to leave my guard gated HOA community? When is the staff going to leave a high-rise condominium? When will the elevators be taken out of service? This needs to be communicated in advance. I'm just going to knock off some related questions here, Donna. David was asking about our app. We actually have a drawbridge app for residents in terms of that communication, but we have an internal app that we use to make sure each of the properties are reported into headquarters, that they're ready for the storm, and then after we check in after to see what the needs are. There was a question about do we have the right to remove people against their will, and the answer is management's not going to do that. Law enforcement may, but we as management are not going to do that.
And if you're a self-managed board, please don't do that. Also, we've got stand your ground laws in Florida. You've got similar laws in Texas. You don't want to be bursting into someone's unit trying to physically remove them. It's not a good idea.
100% agree. Patricia's also saying a lot of our older communities, not everyone has smartphones, and that's true. That's why we still do paper and phone calls. And it's difficult because 90% of the people do have technology, but 100% of the people need to be communicated
so
with.
For those people, it's the posting in the elevator or the mail rooms or in a HOA most HOAs also have some sort of a bulletin board. So, again, don't just rely on one communication channel. To that person's point, 100%. There's certain people that are not, electronically keyed in.
Donna, we have a question about we talked about whether if we have water penetration in the buildings and units need to be dried out before you get mold. Who's responsible for my individual unit? I think this must be referencing a condo, because a home, it would obviously be the homeowner. Who's responsible for that?
So in Florida, the association is going to be responsible to repair or replace damaged drywall and damaged baseboard if the unit was originally constructed with baseboard. And if we get hit with a major hurricane, the association is also going to be responsible for windows and doors. Now, before people start tearing their hair out and when they hear this, remember there's a difference between ordinary maintenance and repair obligations under your documents, which may very well include put on the owners the responsibility to maintain or replace their own windows and their doors, and post-casualty repair and replacement obligations. These are two different things. So if there's a casualty, the association in Florida, a Florida Condo Association, is responsible for items for which the unit was originally constructed. And every unit was constructed with what? Windows, doors, drywall, and most times baseboard. Everything else on the inside of that unit, furniture, carpeting, appliances, everything like that, fixtures, is going to be on the owner, which is why it's so crucial that your owners have interior HO6 coverage. We didn't have an opportunity to talk about that, James, but again, amending your documents to require that coverage, maybe that's for a future day, but it's really important that owners in these buildings have coverage, because they're not going to be able to rebuild if they don't.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. Okay, so now the storm has passed, and we got to get our building back together. Well, actually, before I do that, there was a question that came in about when does the staff leave? And I've got, from the management perspective, we have protocols in terms of either wind speed or time before expected arrival. But the management team, your management team, are people and have to take care of their homes and their families. So a lot of people are surprised when the team leaves, even security guards. They put up the gates and they let so that the emergency vehicles can get in, and they leave. But as long as I think that's communicated, One question we always get, Donna, and we've taken a bit of a different approach. There are some, often a maintenance person or a maintenance supervisor, who can keep that building running through the storm, and often the building is stronger than the home they live in. From an association and from a management perspective, there is some workers' comp risk, but I would rather have my teammates safe and take the workers' comp risk. So we do allow, subject to both the employee and the association's approval, we do allow a teammate to stay to monitor the systems in the building. Do you have any comment from a legal perspective on that?
Well, your approach is correct. I would say for our associations that have direct employees, in other words, they're not using management company staffing, you need to talk to your legal counsel, because there's OSHA regulations as well, where you have a duty to provide a safe workplace. So if you're requiring staff, let's say, in not giving them sufficient time to leave and get home safely and prepare, you may have issues. So make sure that whatever your protocols are with regard to your direct employees, when it comes to leaving when a storm is approaching or returning, because sometimes we've seen direct employees being called back to the community before it's safe to actually re-enter the community. So speak to legal counsel on that.
Okay, two more quick questions. One is, when is it safe to return to the community, and who makes that decision?
An engineer. So I would say get an engineer out in a multifamily building. You want to make sure, and actually, listen, the local fire marshal comes out, but if the storm cuts a wide path, the local officials are not going to be able to get to everyone. So, and this is where it also comes in, have an engineer before you need an engineer. Figure out who you want to use. And then when the bill, because you're going to want to get back in that building, people are going to want to get back in their units. This is also true in our HOAs with attached villas. Get an engineer out there, know who you're going to use ahead of time, maybe reach out to them contractually. And that's who should make the determination, not the manager, not the board. I wouldn't make that determination. You need a structural engineer to tell you it's safe to go in.
Yeah, I think that's excellent advice. Okay, Donna, 12:59. First of all, I want to just kind of do a recap of what we've talked about. I was just following up on your last thing you said. So we talked about video and photography before the storm. It's also important after the storm, because you may have to make some emergency repairs before you get to debate your insurance company. Whatever you do, don't repair until you've documented what the damage was. And a lot of people will wait, and that's a safety issue. Safety is number one. So document, do the emergency repair, and then you've got some support for the subsequent insurance claim. Okay, so we step one, have a plan. Step two, review insurance. Make sure that you've done everything you can to do that. 3, prepare the property. 4, think about where the dollars are coming if there is a claim. 5, communicate again. And then have a plan for the recovery. Think that through. What does that look like? Who's going to be our engineer? When are we going to come back? Talk with staff about when they're leaving and when they're coming back. And then who am I going to call at the insurance? When? What documentation do I need? And we'll do another insurance one this summer, probably, Donna, but to discuss the role of a public adjuster, because boards and even management, this isn't our expertise in terms of how to file sophisticated claims. Wow, Donna, we packed a lot in there. I'm going to give you, as usual, the last word, because you're Hurricane Donna. What did we miss? What's your final thought?
Two final thoughts, James. Two final thoughts. One, it's very important that boards be on the same page here, particularly if you're going to have to evacuate. Find out where every board member is going to be. Make sure your board is communicating with your manager. You may have board members dispersed throughout the state or throughout the country. So figure out before you all take off who's going to be doing what. And then lastly, to your point, if you do get hit, the immediate repairs may just include tarping the roof or covering the windows. Your immediate priority is just to make sure there's no more damage to the building. Please resist the urge to sign a multi-million-dollar repair contract. You still need to undertake the proper due diligence and vetting of your contractors. A lot of times boards panic and they sign off on these large repair contracts when really all they need in the immediate aftermath is just to waterproof the building from further water intrusion. And then take your time and make sure you're selecting the right contractor and your contract is properly reviewed by council.
Well, thank you, Donna. And I had a couple last minute questions there to say, is this recorded? And it is. So later tonight, it'll be up on the castlegroup.com webpage. We still have a banner on the top, COVID and vaccination information. That's where our videos are right now. And if you have any questions for Donna or myself, you're welcome to send them to info@castlegroup.com. And Donna, you haven't said anything about your new podcast. You have 1 minute. I know we're losing our audience here, but tell us about that, because I listened to your first episode. It's really good.
Oh, I wonder why you liked it. So everybody, I do have a podcast. It's called Take It to the Board. You can find it on Spotify. You can find it on your Apple devices, Amazon Music. And James was gracious enough to be my first guest. I would strongly urge you to listen to that first episode because he really dropped some truth bombs in it. So take it to the board.
So you can just search Donna Berger or Take It to the Board, and that's what I did to find it. But congratulations on that, Donna. Okay, we're back. Craig's next one is on June 23rd, and then Donna will be back in July. So thank you, everybody. We appreciate you sticking with us, and good luck with hurricane season. Take care.
Be safe. Thanks.